What's alternative energy is the old stuff, coal, oil, nukes, and gas. Because what we've learned in the past decade in particular is that wind power, solar power, tidal, geothermal, increased mass transit, wave energy, all the other forms of new energy that have come on are profitable, they work, and they work in great bulk, and they can provide us all the energy we need. And that's what the 21st century is about. It is the most significant and most profitable transition that the human race will ever have. The transition to renewable energy will dwarf the dot-com boom of the 1990s and will make us all, if we can do it, if not prosperous, at least survivable on this planet. Now, the very first step we have to take in getting to Solartopia is to make sure, and I've never thought that I'd have to say these words. I mean, the problem with fighting nuclear power is you have to figure out how to drive the stake through the heart of an industry that doesn't have one. And you know, nuclear power is so patently insane and so ridiculously expensive and so absurdly unsustainable that it never occurred to me in the last 20 years that they'd ever try and build any more. I mean, with Kay and Mark and other people over the past 30, 40 years, I've actually been involved in this since 1973. And just as a stroke of hope, I want to tell you that in 1973, when I got involved in this, I was living on one of those hippie farms in western Massachusetts. And I will tell you that all those stories about what went on hippie farms are true. They came in, and having graduated from not only the University of Michigan, but also from the civil rights and that movement, where I actually met Martin Luther King in Grenada, Mississippi, to the anti-war movement, where they tried to shoot me a couple times. And then the transition into the movement against nuclear power was pretty easy and pretty understandable. And so when they came into our town in Montague, Massachusetts, and said they were going to put a nuclear plant 4 miles from our house, I was thrilled because I knew we were going to stop them. And I knew this was the beginning of a major movement. And we coined the phrase "no nukes." Some of you have seen it on your bumpers, I hope. And we went around, some of us went around the country preaching the gospel of anti-nuclear power. Because we understood instinctually that these plants were ridiculous. Even back then, they were too expensive to really contemplate. Even back then, they had a nuclear waste problem which has not been solved. Even back then, we knew that radioactive emissions from nuclear power plants would kill people, especially small children. Even back then, we knew that they would never find, which they have yet to find, a safe dose of radiation, primarily because no embryo or fetus can ever withstand even the smallest dose of radiation. And I love to hear all this talk about pro-life and supporting the fetus and protecting the embryo. Let's start by banning nuclear power plants. That's the true pro-life movement. Even in Alaska, where they don't have nuclear plants, it's a true pro-life movement. And I wish some people would get the message about that. So all that we learned, all that we understood, all that we came to know about nuclear power back in the 1970s, when most of us got involved with this, and there were some people involved earlier, actually. There was actually a reactor stopped in New York City, another one in Oregon, another one in California, which they wanted to build directly over an earthquake fault. You know, the argument was essentially, well, if there's an earthquake, the ground will open up and the reactor will fall right in and nobody will be harmed, you know. So, and that is very true. As I don't have to tell you, you all know about the New Madrid fault. I mean, this is the place where there is the most powerful earthquake fault in North America, right through here. And I live in a state where we have the only nuclear plant in the United States that's actually been damaged, physically damaged by an earthquake. And it's from an offshoot of the New Madrid fault. It's in Perry, Ohio, of all places. How they found an earthquake fault in Ohio is beyond me, but they managed to do it, to put a nuclear plant there. I think space aliens will come down to Earth and whenever they're going to come, and they're going to surmise that nuclear plants were actually primitive markers for earthquake faults because they've seen to do that so efficiently and so well. But you know, the reality is that the problems with nuclear power that we understood to be true in the early 1970s have not in any way, shape, or form gone away. And we were extremely successful in the 1970s in stopping the nuclear power industry. You know, Richard Nixon, where is he now that we need him, gave a speech on national television in 1974 in the midst of the Arab oil embargo saying that there would be 1,000 nuclear plants in the United States by the year 2000. And I saw him on TV, and I said, no way. And we organized, we had demonstrations at Seabrook and Diablo Canyon and Callaway and at 3 Mile Island before it melted, and many other nuclear plants, and we organized grassroots opposition all over the country, and we prevented about 890 reactors from being built.
Satsum, too. Stopped Satsum in Washington.
We stopped a lot of them, and you know, at the peak, the industry had about 115. Right now they have 104, which is 104 too many, but it ain't 1,000. I mean, given the demographics, Missouri would have had 20. Can you imagine 20 atomic reactors in Missouri? What patent insanity. And we argued way back when that these reactors weren't economic, and if they took the money from nuclear power plants that they were going to spend on nuclear plants and put it instead into renewable energy, which just was barely starting to get going back then, that we could have an economy based on renewable energy. And they didn't listen to us, of course, and they went and blew a lot of money anyway, and they spent it on Vietnam and now on Iraq and on all these other wars that they seem to want to wage all the time. But the reality is that we had a model. We had a gathering in 1975 in Western Massachusetts. We talked about wind power, we talked about solar, we talked about increased efficiency. There was a guy there named William Hieronymus who was pioneering windmills offshore. There was another guy who's still around named Amory Lovins who was talking about increased energy efficiency. There was a guy here in St. Louis who was very influential named Barry Commoner who talked about a transition to renewables. And so we had it all there right in the 1970s, and then Jimmy Carter came in, and we thought things were going to move ahead, and it didn't quite happen. And I want to point out to you, by the way, that what goes around comes around. Jimmy Carter in 1976 made promises to us. We caught him in New Hampshire as people were being arrested at the Seabrook nuclear plant. He promised us to us about what kind of nuclear plants would be built. He said they'd be underground and away from people and all these other things. And then when he got in the White House, he didn't keep his word. And Seabrook was approved even though it didn't meet those standards, and so was a reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, Unit 2. And Unit 2 went online on December 28th, 1978. And what was the big accomplishment of Jimmy Carter? The Camp David Accords. Remember, he got Menachem Begin and Yasser Arafat all together, and they all got the Nobel Prize, and they settled at least a piece of the Middle East thing, and Jimmy was the great hero, and he was going to sail that way into the 1980 election. Well, guess what happened 36 hours later? 3 Mile Island Unit 2 melted, which he had approved without meeting all the specifications he promised. And all of a sudden, everybody forgot about Camp David, and there he was in his booties. And the next thing you know, we got Ronald Reagan in the White House killing off the solar industry and ripping the solar panels off the White House, which worked absolutely perfectly. And before Reagan came in the 4 years that Carter was in there doing the Solar Energy Institute in Colorado and the National Renewable Energy Lab and doing the small things that he did to promote renewable energy, we had 20, 30,000 people with jobs in California and elsewhere working on renewable energy. California, with Jerry Brown as governor, installed 17,000 windmills, and about half of them worked. Half of them were, just tax scams. But the reality is that we were headed in that direction. And we had what we call Reagan interruptus, where Reagan came in and he just ripped everything apart. And the next thing you know, we didn't have a renewable energy industry. But thankfully, there were places like Denmark and Japan and Israel and other countries which did go ahead with green power. And so in the 1990s, lo and behold, we did manage to put the nuclear power industry in the deep freeze. We thought it was dead. But as we know in this country, he who laughs has not yet heard the bad news. And so in the 1990s, the Danes and other countries came out with very advanced windmills. And we now are at the point where wind power is very profitable. There is absolutely no disputing that wind power, which they all laughed at us and said, oh, you guys are blah, 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 and you're a bunch of hippies and so on. Wind power is now the most powerful, the most profitable, the most prolific new form of energy generation being built in the world today. It's an industry that's growing at 25 to 30% a year globally. And the reality is that between the Mississippi, and we're on the west side of the Mississippi, right, all the way to the Rocky Mountains, between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains, we have sufficient wind power with currently available technology to generate 300% of the electricity used by the United States.